So welcome to the final lecture in the Sartre course. I hope you've enjoyed it. So today we're going to turn to one of Sartre's last works, certainly one of his last major works, which is the Critique of Dialectical Reason. So if you've done the reading, you'll know that you can see that he's made quite a radical shift from those really early works. If you think back to Nausea presents this ideal, or this idea at least, of the lone existential hero in the city. Now, what we've got here in the Critique of Dialectical Reason is we've got a fully fledged account of the structure of society and the way in which groups function. Now, we've only looked at extracts today, so we're only going to be able to look at the kind of the rough outlines of what's going on here. And I have to confess that, like most people who work on Sartre, the Critique of Dialectical Reason is a text that I don't know as well as the others, but it's a very, very important work, and second only perhaps to Being and Nothingness. So Being and Nothingness is written when Sartre is at his most influential, and it has an immediate impact on the philosophical world. So that's 1943. And by the time the Critique of Dialectical Reason comes out, we've got a very, very different world that it's coming out into in terms of the philosophical world. So existentialism has already started to be displaced by another movement called structuralism that's come into place. And so it didn't have the same reception that Being and Nothingness had. Now, what Sartre is trying to do in this text, really, is expand the account of Being and Nothingness by developing an account of society. Now, what Sartre is doing here is he's combining two very, very different trends. Now, first of all, and there are some people who argue against this, but I think it's quite clear that the ontology that we found in Being and Nothingness is still very much present in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. So we still got the emphasis on the individual working all the way through the text, and the recognition of individual freedom is what drives society forwards. Now, what that's married with is an account that borrows really heavily from Marxist thought. So there's the claim that what we're developing here, for instance, is a critique of dialectical reason. And by dialectical, we're talking about the Marxist, the materialist dialectic that we find in Marx's writings. So the reading I've given you is a selection from the Critique of Pure Reason, and it develops just a few moments of Sartre's account. But we can see, nonetheless, a number of themes that take Sartre beyond the kind of analysis that we've looked at so far in Being and Nothingness and in those texts on the imagination and the emotions, etc. So principally, Sartre is addressing, I think, 2 points that are very, very underplayed in Being and Nothingness. Now, the first of these is the question of history. So if you've read Heidegger, you'll know that for Heidegger, the role of history is much, much stronger than it is for Sartre. So Sartre has a much stronger belief that when we engage in the world, we're able to turn the way we use objects around us to the projects that we have. So if you want to change a light bulb, then you're going to try and find a step ladder to get up to the appropriate height. But if you can't find a step ladder, you'll take a chair and you'll transform the social meaning of that chair by using it as a ladder. So what we're doing there is we're overriding the prescribed meaning of the object in the light of our projects. So there's a kind of radical freedom in Sartre in the way we use the world. But what happens in the Critique of Dialectical Reason is we have a much greater development of the notion of being in itself. And they're not quite the same, but being in itself is roughly equated with what Sartre here calls the practico-inert. Now, what happens here really is that the being in itself is understood far more as constituted by the acts of others, even if the meaning of those acts needs to be reinstated by us. So in a sense, therefore, the critique of dialectical reason brings in a theory of history that's kind of largely missing from Being and Nothingness. Now, second, in Being Nothingness, the account of our relations with other people, as we've seen, is fundamentally antagonistic. So it doesn't account well for any kind of collective action. Now, what's going to happen in the critique of dialectical reason is that we're still going to find that there are problematic features to our relationships with others. I think that's something one can't get away from. But Sartre starts opening up a distinction between two different ways in which assemblages of people can be organised. So they can be organised in terms of collectives and groups. Now, collectives organise individuals in a way that makes them essentially replaceable, and that's contrasted with the group. And the group takes is what Sartre understands to be a unit that involves some kind of internal coherence. So we've got an opposition between the collective, which is a kind of abstract form of existence, and the group, which has a much more concrete nature. So today what I want to do is I want to go through the topics in the following order. I want to start by talking a little bit about the way in which groups, not in the technical sense, but just assemblages of people, operate in Being and Nothingness. Then we'll turn to the collective, and in particular the notion of a series. And we'll focus on, and Sartre provides lots of examples of this, so the collective is understood in terms of the broadcaster who broadcasts to the population as if they're kind of like one form, and the example of the marketplace where everyone takes on roles that are prescribed. But what we'll look at here is Sartre's example of the bus queue. And for the final part of the lecture, I wanted to look at the group infusion. Now, group infusion is a term that Sartre uses to refer, the longest example he gives is of the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille. So the way in which the city of Paris forms a unified group. So we'll look at the way in which that's transformed through the notion of the oath into a more permanent structure, and the notion of the terror, and the way in which those groups can collapse back into collective structures. So what he talks about here is the notion of the institution as this structure that sort of fixes things and prevents us from properly relating to each other. Okay. So just to begin, just really to give this some context, because we haven't really covered this, in Being and Nothingness, Sartre does talk about being with others, so what Heidegger calls Mitsein, being with. And he talks about it in two different ways. He considers it when we form a group with others, where we become an object, and he calls that the us. And he considers it where we work together on shared projects, and he calls that the we. So I'll just talk really briefly about these two modes before we get on to look at the critique of dialectical reason itself. So where do we get the sense of an us? That is a kind of a group object. Well, the kind of phenomenon Sartre is talking about here is what we might find at a football match, or perhaps what Marx would consider to be class consciousness. Now, Sartre's claim is that these kinds of structures, where we form an us, they do involve me forming part of a group, but they rely on the objectifying presence of the other. So what unites me with other people is the fact that we're both looked at and understood as forming a situation by the other. So the notion of a group is something here in Being and Nothingness that emerges outside of the group itself. You know, we're looked at and transcended by an individual outside of the group. Now, there's an interesting consequence of this, which is that if you form a group on the basis of a moment outside, then humanity itself cannot be thought as a group without the presence of a third moment which is outside of humanity, or like an nth moment, an extra moment. Now, for this reason, Sartre argues that humanity itself is a theological notion. It relies on the notion of God as the observer that fixes us all. So that's the us. That's where we're seen as an object. Now, there is another way in being in nothingness that Sartre talks about the way in which we can be related together. And that's where we act like a collective subject rather than the sort of subject that's the result of the look of the other. So we're frequently addressed as a subject capable of acting with others. So when you get your university timetable, for instance, that presupposes that you are a group who share a project. In fact, this lecture that I'm giving now presupposes that you're all a group who share a project. So in a sense, I'm addressing you now as a common subject, and I'm ignoring the differences between you all. Now, in that sense, the structure of the we is very much like Heidegger's notion of das Man. Nonetheless, Sartre thinks that this form of consciousness is derivative. So, when a sign addresses me as a member of a group, I can simply choose to ignore it. So, this lecture or a timetable addresses you as a member of a group, but you can easily take that timetable that you're given, if it's a piece of paper, and fold it up to make sure your table's no longer wonky, for instance. So, while there's a commonality of the sign for all of you, the use you make of it is going to be determined by your own projects. So what that means is that prior to those kind of collective things that tie us together, there has to be a relationship with the other in order for us to understand them as relating to us in terms of a commonality. Okay, so that's being in nothingness, as you expect. Essentially, it's the same claim we've looked at several times, that while something may appear to constrain us, that's only because of the sense that we give to it. Now, how does that develop in the critique of dialectical reason? Well, the first account that Sartre gives here is of the queue for the bus. And this is the example of what he calls a series. And here's how Sartre describes it. At this level, we can once again recognise the same society in which we just saw as an agent of massification, insofar as its practical inert being serves as an environment conducive to inter-individual reciprocities. For these separate men form a group, insofar as they are all standing on the same sidewalk, protecting them from cars crossing the square, insofar as they are grouped around the same bus stop, etc. And especially those individuals form a group in that they have a common interest. That is, insofar as, separated as organic individuals, a structure of their practico-inert being is common to them and unites them from without. They are all, or almost all, employees, users of the bus line, knowing the frequency and timetable of the buses. Consequently, they are waiting for the same vehicle, the 7:49 bus. This object, in as far as they are dependent upon it, breakdowns, failures, accidents, is their present interest. But this present interest, since they all live in the same district, goes back to fuller and deeper structures of their general interest, improvement of public transportation, stabilisation of fares, etc. The bus they wait for unites them, as being their interest as individuals who this morning have business on the other side of town. But already as the 7:49, it's their interest as users. Everything is temporalised. The individual passenger recognises himself as resident, that is, he reflects the 5 or 10 preceding years. And at the same time, the vehicle is characterised by its daily eternal return, Actually, it is in fact the same, with the same driver and conductor. The object acquires a structure which exceeds its pure inert existence. It is provided as such with a passive future and past, which present it to passengers as a small fragment of their destiny. Okay, so there's a little joke about the eternal return of the same in there, just noticed. Okay, so there are a number of features of this analysis. First of all, we've got an actual unity here, insofar as the members of the queue for the bus share a common purpose of attempting to get to the other side of town to conduct their business. As such, we've got a unity that's established by a common purpose. But this unity, however, is an abstraction. It operates on the basis of this kind of abstract notion. So we form a group only insofar as we don't see ourselves as full individuals, but only understand ourselves in terms of the shared interest of getting to the other side of town. In this respect, we're capable of action. So if the bus breaks down, we might work together to try and find another way to get to the other side of town. But it's an action limited to the shared framework that's developed by our common interests. Now, there are essentially two aspects to this unity that Sartre is drawing out here. First, we're united by our desire to catch the bus. And in that sense, but in a sense, in relation to this, we're replaceable in terms of that unity of the bus queue. So any of us waiting for the bus could be replaced by another without affecting the nature of the structure itself. Second, although we're replaceable, there's also a series here. So there are a limited number of spaces on the bus. So the order we take in the queue is important. So we form an ordered series where one of us is first, one of us is second, and one is third. Now that's important because if you get to the bus stop too late, you're going to miss the bus because there isn't space on the bus for everyone to go. Now, finally, the last point is the structure of the collective here is determined not merely by the individuals, but also by the material context they find themselves in. So the objects, their relations, even the language used, determine the materials that in turn determine the situation of the individuals. So this leads to the contradiction at the heart of this situation. Each member of the group is replaceable, but at the same time, some members have priority due to their serial place in the group. So there's a necessary conflict between the individual, and that conflict emerges from the conditions of scarcity. There's a limited number of seats on the bus. Now, Sartre's claim is going to be that while scarcity of course exists, one of the features of capitalism is that it perpetuates and exacerbates conditions of scarcity in order to reinforce these structures of seriality we find in society. Okay. So let's turn to the section on alienation to work out exactly how this relation to material conditions affects freedom. Now, Sartre here develops what's quite a classical Marxist theory, Marxist analysis, and that's of the relationship of the girl in the factory to the machinery that she's working on. Now, what happens in the factory is that the rhythms of the girl's life have to be adjusted to conform to the rhythms of the machinery that she's operating. So there's a fundamental moment of alienation in her behaviour. She needs to adopt these rhythms that are alien to her, that come from the machinery, and override the natural kind of biological rhythms of her life. Now, that's quite a classical account, but there are a couple of features here that are very Sartrean. First, for Sartre, it's going to be the case that she freely chooses to overcome this initial feeling of the machine being alien in order to kind of give herself to the machine. So there's an element of freedom in Sartre's account here that's missing from traditional Marxist accounts. Now, the other thing is this free choice is conditioned by a whole series of necessities that govern her situation. So her family will need a certain number of people to work in the factory in order for them to survive as a family. There's going to be a specific nature to the way in which the factory organises work, etc., etc., etc. And that means that her choice is going to be very, very limited. And in fact, Sartre here argues that her choices really are to adapt to the machinery or to find herself ultimately eliminated from the labour market and finally from society itself through sickness and starvation and eventually death. So there is freedom, but it's a very, very limited freedom in this account. But it's still the case that she needs to take up the demands of the machine personally. Now, the final point, and once again this ties in very closely to being in nothingness, is that the necessity that the girl feels in this situation doesn't come from the matter of the factory itself. Now, it's mediated by that matter, but ultimately it's other people who constrain her freedom, and the actions of others are mediated through the way in which the factory is organised. So the constraints that we encounter, therefore, even here in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, are governed by other people and only mediated through matter. Then that applies not only to the people present now, but also people who are no longer present. So if you think about the structure of language, that governs what I do to some degree, and it introduces necessities into the way in which we relate to the world. But those structures of language are defined by projects that are now kind of sedimented within language by people who are no longer alive. So what this means is that the necessities that prevent us from being free, just as in being in nothingness, but in a far more complicated way, arise in our situation through the complex structure of others in relation to material. So here's a quote from Sartre on the topic. So he says, from this point of view, it must be pointed out both that the practico inert field exists, that it is real, and that free human activities are not thereby eliminated, that they are not even altered in their translucidity as projects in the process of being realised. The field exists. In short, it is what surrounds and conditions us. I need only glance out of the window, I will be able to see cars which are men and drivers who are cars, a policeman who is directing traffic at the corner of the street, and a little further on, the same traffic being controlled by a red and green light. Hundreds of exigencies rise up towards me, pedestrian crossings, notices, prohibitions, collectives, a branch of the Credit Lyonnais, a cafe, a church, blocks of flats, and also a visible seriality, people queuing in front of a shop, and instruments, pavements, a thoroughfare, a taxi rank, a bus stop, etc., proclaiming with their frozen voices how they are to be used. These beings, neither thing nor man, but practical unities made up of man and inert things, these appeals and these exigencies do not yet concern me directly. Later I will go down the street and become their thing. I will buy that collective which is a newspaper, and suddenly the practico inert ensemble which besieges and designates me will reveal itself on the basis of the total field, that is to say, of the earth as the elsewhere of all elsewheres, or as the series of all series of series. Okay. So there's a kind of necessity in the world, but it doesn't come from a kind of coefficient of adversity, which is what Sartre talks about in the situation stuff we looked at last week. Rather, it's a form of alienation of our freedom. Our actions are still free, but they operate within the context of constraints and meanings that we take to be necessary. And Joseph Catalano gives an example of the farmer, for instance, who grows food on his farm. And when the farm is sold and it's kind of commodified, his action doesn't change. He still grows food on the farm. But because that farm's now owned by a corporation, the meaning of that action is radically transformed and taken away from him. So the same action becomes affected by what Sartre calls a counter-finality. It starts to act against itself because it's alienated by collective structures and institutions. Okay. So the collective is one form of structure, but Sartre does talk about another kind of structure as well, which is a structure whereby one acts with other people. Now, the first form that we encounter in the text of this is called the group infusion, and it's a more authentic way of being with others. So it's the basis of Sartre's understanding of the concept of class. Now, ultimately, the Marxist notion of class for Sartre is a specific form of group. So the group has priority over the class, I think. That's my reading anyway. So the group first appears as this group infusion. And it's an amorphous form of group that emerges spontaneously in response to a particular threat in the correct historical circumstances. Now, the example Sartre deals with is the storming of the Bastille. So this occurs after a period when the individuals within the city of Paris have suffered deprivations, and they've suffered through this form of serial collectivity. But what happens when the Bastille is stormed, or prior to that moment, is that there's a group that spontaneously forms with a shared project. Now, prior to the storming of the Bastille, there's what Sartre calls a moment of imitation and enthusiasm. So the citizens of Paris are threatened by the king's dragoons, and this threat leads to a form of group cohesion. Now, first of all, in an effort to find weapons where they're trying to preserve themselves, there's also a deeper recognition of a shared purpose. So each of the people within the city sees in their action the actions of others as others search for weapons. So there's a recognition of a parallel between what they're doing and what other people are doing too. So Sartre says that to imitate in these still inert movements is to discover simultaneously oneself in the process of performing one's own action over there in the other, and performing here in oneself the action of the other, fleeing in one's own flight and that of the other, attacking with a single attack in the other, and with his own fists, without agreement or accord, in fact, exactly the opposite of an agreement, but realising and living the otherness on the basis of the synthetic unity of a totalisation, organised into come of the gathering by an external group. So what we've got here is a kind of amorphous structure forming a group infusion that emerges when, in the French Revolution, the rioters realise that the box containing guns that had been promised to them by Jacques de Flesselles contains rags. Now, at that moment, they realise, or at least they believe, that they've been tricked by de Flesselles, and what had been an abstract unity becomes a personal unity. And as Sartre puts it, each member of the crowd begins to act as a singular incarnation of a common person. Okay, so that's the first phase. In relation to the threat, they imitate each other, they see their actions in the other, and then at some particular moment, they move to see the crowd, the individuals within the crowd begin to see themselves as sharing a common personal project. Now, I'll talk about the oath in a sec, but once again, it's important to know that for Sartre, that moment could have happened differently. So it could have been the case that the individuals didn't form that kind of collective group infusion, and that they carried on in a state of, for instance, enthusiasm that would ultimately collapse back into seriality. So there's a free choice to take up the situation given and to organise into a group. Okay, so the oath. The storming of the Bastille involves the group acting with unity, and it differentiates itself into different roles. Now, what doesn't happen with the group when they're defending themselves against the dragoons is the group doesn't reflect on its own nature. But this reflection does begin to occur when the threat that gives rise to it begins to recede. So as the dragoons are pushed back and Paris forms a sort of order, there's the risk that without that fear that organised them, they'll collapse back into the state of seriality. Now, the key point here is what Sartre calls the oath. The oath is a way in which the group tries to preserve a moment of unity. And we can make two really important points about the oath here. First of all, the oath is once again a way in which our freedom becomes limited, just as it is for the practical inert and for others. Now, you'll remember when we looked at being and nothingness that the only way that our freedom can be limited and restricted ultimately is through other people. So insofar as they transcend our transcendence, etc., etc. Now that's the case too with the collective. You know, it feels like a situation, but when we look at it more closely, Sartre argues, we find that the structures are really infused with other individuals. So, as he said in that example, you know, you see the car and you see the driver, and the two are kind of like intermingled. At this point, you see a policeman directing traffic. At the next junction, there's a set of traffic lights, and so these roles of person and thing are merged together, and it's the other individual that's limiting our freedom through the practical inert. What happens with the oath is that our freedom is restricted, but we restrict it ourselves in order to allow the group to perpetuate itself in existence. Now, the second thing is, this obviously feels a bit like Hobbes or someone like that, where we have an oath, a social contract. But that's not the case for Sartre. It's radically different from that, because the group already exists as a group infusion. So this isn't a way of constituting a group, but a way of transposing a structure that's already present into a more stable form. So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay. Now, Sartre introduces the notion of the terror in order to explain why it is that the oath continues to hold power over members of the group. So in terms of the terror, he's talking both about the revolutionary terror, where revolutionaries kind of turned in on themselves, but he's also talking about things like the purges of Stalin, you know, where the structure becomes sort of inward-facing and problematic. Now, the oath really creates two problems. The first of which is that the oath is made by free individuals. So it opens up the question of how it's going to persist, given the inherent freedom of the individuals who constitute it. But we've also got to ask how the oath's going to persist, given that the initial moment of fear that holds together the group has dissipated. Now, in effect, what Sartre is going to claim is that once the external danger of the group is dealt with, the group will tend to maintain its unity by recognising an internal danger or an internal fear in relation to the structure of the group. So the terror we find in the group isn't an attempt of, for instance, a section of the group to wrest power from the rest. The terror is an attempt on the part of the group to resist a return to seriality. So by turning inwards, it kind of develops this project of the terror as a kind of purification to keep itself in a state of group infusion or groupness. So here's what Sartre says at this point. He says, and in whatever historical circumstance we may be considering, the terror arises out of opposition to seriality, not freedom. Indeed, if its origin, and in its manifestations as well, it is freedom liquidating by means of violence the indefinite flight of the other, that is, powerlessness. At the convention, the terror is born of the objective contradiction between the necessity for a common practice, free and indivisible, and the objective but elusive, and moreover unformulated, divisions of a governing assembly that remains in turmoil altered by the violence it is experienced. In this fundamental atmosphere, the free praxis is suspect. Seriality mediated by freedom is revealed, then, as passive otherness, and consequently, practical freedom is denounced as the creator of otherness. Okay. So the final category that Sartre introduces is the institution, or the final category we're going to talk about is the institution. Sartre doesn't think that all institutions are bad, but in the extract we're looking at, Sartre is presenting what's essentially the notion of a degenerated institution. Now, the institution emerges through essentially a process of sedimentation of the praxis of the group. So the group becomes kind of frozen in some form and is no longer determined by its common good. So Sartre talks about the institution as the kind of the carcass of the group, or as a function of alienated ends. Now, what's at the heart of this is the idea that the institution now mediates my relations with others in such a way that I myself feel powerless in relation to it. So I no longer relate directly to others as in the group, but instead my relations are all mediated by this institutional structure that itself is something that I on my own am unable to change. So he says that the institution as such possesses a considerable force of inertia, not only because it is a part of an institutional whole and cannot be modified without all the other parts being modified, but particularly and in itself because it posits itself by and in its inert being as essentiality, defining men as the inessential means of its perpetuation. So the institution takes on a life of its own. But this inessentiality comes neither from the institution to the individual, nor from the individual to the institution. In actual fact, what becomes isolated is the practice, insofar as it's produced in a common setting defined by new human relationships. These relationships are quite simply based upon serial powerlessness. If I apprehended the institution as fundamentally unchangeable, it is because my praxis itself is determined in the institutionalized group as incapable of changing the institution. And this powerlessness originates in my relation of circular otherness with the other members of the group. Now, the institution moves us from the situation in the group where we all work for each other and where we feel we have a duty to operate in a certain way in relation to others, to a situation where instead in the institution we feel that we need to earn the right to perform our function. So we're no longer essential in relation to the group or sharing the same essentiality as the group, but we're inessential in relation to an institution that has power over us. So, I guess in the background here is Hegel's theory of the state, for instance. Now, the figure who emerges from this situation, Sartre defines as institutional man. So institutional man is the form of existence, the form of life that operates effectively within this kind of matrix of the institution. So he says that institutional man must obtain this recognition through two opposed and simultaneous practices. On the one hand, when his institutional power is not directly in question, the general tactic is to liquidate the other in himself in order to liquidate it in the others. The officer living in the midst of his men, regulating his whole life by theirs. On the other hand, when the moment of exercising power arrives, the institutional man is suddenly constituted as absolute other through his playing a role and wearing of a uniform. He establishes a tenacity of exercised power, decisions taken, etc., upon his institutional being, that is, upon the inertia and the total opacity of otherness, which has become the particular institution's presence in him, and hence the group's presence as common praxis. So we end up in this situation where the institution ultimately begins to operate through figures rather than figures operating themselves. And the institution kind of pushes us into a position of inessentiality in relation to it. Now, what we end up with here, I think, is a set of cyclical interrelations between serial collectives and groups. So we talked about serial collectives first, but it's not clear for Sartre whether groups or serial collectives comes first. There's no hierarchy there. Each of them can move into the other. Now, okay, that's all I want to really say about the critique of dialectical reason today. It's just really to give you a taste of it. But I hope you can see at least that what starts to emerge in these later writings in the 60s and beyond is a much more nuanced account of how others might restrict our freedom and how we might work with others than we found in Being and Nothingness, for instance. So we're now beginning to develop the idea of a group that can operate together in order to accomplish aims through a kind of recognition of myself in the other and the other in me. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, guys. I've really enjoyed this course. So I'll see you later this week to talk about the material. See you soon. Bye.